So this lesson is going to be combined. We're going to go over the vocabulary words that we went over yesterday in class. So if you weren't with us, you will be able to see your vocabulary words and understand their meanings. And then we're going to look at our comprehension concept for this week. So the first word that we're looking at is afford. Now, when you can afford something, that means you have enough money to pay for it. So one of the examples that we talked about in class were buying a boat, buying a new PlayStation. Unfortunately, I don't feel like I could afford a private island, but I do think that I could afford a PlayStation if I save my money. So, afford means to have enough money to pay for something. Next word is loan. Now, a loan is money borrowed. So anytime that you borrow money, you could consider it a loan. So if you ever want to go to college, you're probably going to have to take out a loan. If you want to buy a house, you're probably going to have to take out a loan. So a loan is money borrowed. The next word that we're looking at for our vocabulary is profit. So we're thinking about a business. Profit is the amount of money that they take home at the end of the day. So when you think about it, it is money left over after all the business costs have been paid. So, anytime you go into business, you want to make sure that you are making a profit. Otherwise, your business isn't going to last very long. The next word on our list is prosper. When you prosper, you do well, and you become successful. For example, if you listen and take notes and do your work in my class, you will prosper. The next word is risk. A risk is the chance of loss or harm. Now, we talked about in class how not every risk you take is going to be a bad one. For example, if you try out for a sport, that is taking a risk. Now, if you don't make it, there is a chance of losing. There is a chance of not making it. But trying out for a sport is an example of a healthy risk to take. There are lots of unhealthy risks that you can take, many of which I'm sure you guys have discussed in your health classes in the past. So the next word we're going to look at here is savings. So savings is money set aside for the future. So, when you start working, it is always a good idea to put money aside to save for the future, because you never know what would happen. The next word on our list is a word that I'm sure we are familiar with one way or another, and that is scarce. When something is scarce, it is difficult to find. It is difficult to get or find. I don't know about you, but anytime I think about the word scarce, I think about last spring when people were trying to get toilet paper and there was none to be found. It was very scarce. It was difficult to get or find. There were a lot of things that were scarce at that point in time. And the last word that we're going to look at is wages. Now, wages are payments received for work done. So when you get to the point where you're able to get a job, you will earn wages, and wages are payments received for work done. So just to go through our vocabulary words, we have afford, and that means you have enough money to pay for something. We have loan, and that is money borrowed. We have profit, and that is money left over after all of the business costs have been paid. We have prosper, and that means to do well and become successful. We have risk, and that is a chance of loss or harm. We have savings, which is money set aside for the future, and then we have scarce, and that means it's difficult to get or find. And the last word is wages, and these are payments received for work done. I'm sure you probably have gathered that our story is going to have to do something with money, and you are correct. Our anchor text this week is one hen, and in this story, a student is looking for a way to provide enough food for people in his community. So these words are going to come into play. Now for comprehension, we are going to be reading a realistic fiction text. A realistic fiction text has 3 criteria that we're going to look at. The first one is that it is going to tell about everyday events that can happen in real life. Now, you can figure this out pretty rapidly when you're reading, because if you're reading a story and you can relate to the characters and you know what they're experiencing because you probably have experienced it yourself. So realistic fiction text tells about everyday events that could happen in life. Another characteristic of realistic fiction is that it can present true-to-life characters. These are going to be characters that you can see yourself in. These are characters that you can relate to. These are characters that are a lot like ourselves and our friends. So, a realistic fiction text has characters that are going to be true to life. They're not going to have any extraordinary powers, or they're not going to be doing extraordinary things. They're just going to be regular, everyday people. And finally, the last characteristic in realistic fiction, the final thing is that it includes dialogue and descriptive details. So your true-to-life characters are going to be having conversations with other characters in the story. There's going to be a lot of descriptive details that are going to carry us through the literary elements of the story. And while we're on the topic of literary elements, let's go ahead and introduce some of the ones that I want you guys to keep a lookout for when we start reading our shared read and our anchor text. Have you ever seen those shows where they show a person in the hospital bed and they have a heartbeat? And generally speaking, the heartbeat looks something like this. And then it goes up. And then it may go down, and then it's steady. I like to use this analogy to think about the way a story unfolds. So because we're reading literature, we're reading fiction, we are going to be reading a story. So generally, unless it is a bad story, the events are going to unfold something that looks like this. So in the beginning of the story, you are going to be introduced to the characters. This is where you're going to find out the setting. This is where you're going to find out about the characters in the story. Now, generally speaking, the introduction lasts until, as you can see right here, there's going to be a problem. So a conflict, there's going to be a problem that the main characters have to solve. So as they figure out how to solve this conflict, we are introduced to something that is called the rising action, and this is where the story gets a little bit better because the characters are going to have to deal with a conflict that is being presented here, right here at the bottom. So it does start out kind of flat, and generally some stories are really hard to get into because the introduction is kind of flat. We have settings, we have characters, we need to know what's going on until there's a problem. So as the problem is being introduced and as the characters are solving the problem, we have something called the rising action. Rising action is when the story starts to get good. It's when the characters are confronting the conflict that is being presented. Now, this rising action continues to rise, and you can feel the tension building and building and building until we get to the most exciting part of the story. This is generally called the climax. But I personally like to call this the turning point. Because in the turning point, that is when we can kind of see how the problem is going to get solved. So this is where things start to get a little bit different. This is where the story takes a turn. This is where we're going to see how the story might end. This is a good point in the story to start making predictions. So, at the climax, the most exciting part of the story, you are going to be hanging on the edge of your seat, waiting to see what happens next. And then, after this most exciting part of the story, we have something that we like to call the falling action. Now, this is how things start coming to a head. This is where things start becoming resolved. This is where the conflict is starting to come together, and you're figuring out how to solve the problem. So as we're figuring more and more out about this, we are going to get to the resolution. And the resolution is going to be the end of the story. This is how the conflict gets solved. So how the problem is resolved, it doesn't necessarily mean every single story we read is going to have a happy ending. It just means that the conflict is coming to an end, regardless of the result. So what I want you guys to do is I want you to think of a movie that you've watched, maybe a TV show, maybe even a video game that you played. And I want you to start thinking about it in terms of this plot structure. So in the beginning of the TV show or in the beginning of the movie, you're probably introduced to the characters. You're probably introduced to the setting. You're probably introduced to what's going to happen. And then there's a conflict. And as this problem is being presented, things start getting good. You are trying to figure out how these characters are even going to confront this problem. And then, the most exciting part of the story. And then we have the turning point where things start coming down. And you can see how everything is coming together. And the problem is going to get solved one way or another. And then at the very end of the story, there's a resolution. It's how the conflict gets solved. Now, that doesn't mean there's a happy ending. That doesn't mean it's a sad ending. It just means it's the ending. It's how the conflict is solved. So think of a TV show. Think of a movie. Now, I'm personally going to think about a Disney movie that maybe most of you have seen. And if you haven't, you're missing out. So I'm going to think about The Little Mermaid because I love The Little Mermaid. It is one of my favorite movies ever. So in the introduction, we are in the beginning of the movie. There is a musical number with a lot of the fish, and you are introduced to Ariel. And the way that you're introduced to Ariel is that she wasn't a part of it because she was too busy exploring the ocean with her friend Flounder. So they are in the ocean. You're introduced to her family and how she's different from her family, and you're introduced to the main character, Ariel. Now the conflict is that she is fascinated with the world that is above the sea. She keeps finding things from that world, and she is fascinated by it. She wants to be a part of that world. Now, the rising action happens when Ursula, the sea witch, decides to grant her her wish. So then she is a part of this world, and she's finding it difficult to fit in. Now, the turning point here, I think the most exciting part of the story in The Little Mermaid is when they announce that there's going to be a wedding, because you think that Ariel is finally going to get her wish. But unfortunately, as we discover, Ursula wasn't done. She was going to be the one getting married. So during the falling action, you can kind of see how the story is getting resolved, because somebody's getting married. We just don't know who he's going to get married to. So with the help of her friends that we were introduced to, they were able to fight off the sea witch, and the resolution of the story, the happy ending, is that Ariel and Prince Eric get married and they live happily ever after. So I'm hoping that this wasn't too confusing. If you have any questions, please let me know, and we will continue to go over this. We are going to be looking at plot structure this entire week, and then next week, this is the skill that we're focusing on. So, I hope this makes sense. I want you to think of a movie or a TV show and try to map it out in terms of this plot structure. So, I would get a separate sheet of paper, draw a little plot mountain, think about the introduction. How do you know who the characters are? Where does the story take place? And what is the conflict? What is the problem that they are trying to solve in the story, or the story that is being presented through the movie? And how do the main characters go about trying to solve the problem? And then what's the turning point? When do things start getting really exciting? And then, how are they coming to solve the problem? And finally, we're going to have a resolution. So I want you to try to map that out. Now, if you have ideas, I want you to share them. I'm going to open a discussion in this folder, so you should be able to see it, where you can talk about your movie and what the plot structure is. So that is optional. I just want to give you guys a chance to talk to each other and interact. Please use the chat responsibly. And if you need help using that, send me a message. So I'm going to open that up. I want you guys to think about your favorite movie, favorite TV show. Make sure it is appropriate. And we will discuss that